In the year 1820, the British Empire stood at the height of its global reach, governing territories across continents and commanding naval supremacy over the world's oceans. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the landscape of England, drawing populations from rural villages into rapidly expanding cities where factories belched smoke into gray skies and narrow streets teemed with workers who labored under conditions that would leave them exhausted and often injured by day's end. London had grown into a metropolis of more than 1 million inhabitants, its boundaries expanding outward as new neighborhoods arose to house merchants, laborers, civil servants, and the growing professional class that managed the empire's administrative machinery. The social order of early 19th century Britain remained firmly stratified, with the aristocracy and landed gentry occupying the uppermost tiers of society. Their wealth derived from estates that had been held by families for generations, passed down through careful arrangements of marriage and inheritance that preserved both property and privilege. Below them stood the expanding middle class, composed of manufacturers, bankers, lawyers, physicians, and others whose fortunes came not from inherited land, but from enterprise, education, and professional practice. This middle class, though lacking the ancient lineage of the nobility, had begun to exert considerable influence over the economic and political direction of the nation, their interests represented in Parliament and their values shaping the moral and intellectual climate of the age. For women of the upper and middle classes, the prescribed sphere of activity remained confined almost entirely to the domestic realm. Marriage and motherhood stood as the expected and proper destiny for a young woman of good family, and the years before marriage were to be spent in the acquisition of accomplishments deemed suitable for a future wife and mother. A young woman might learn to play the piano, to sketch landscapes, to read French or Italian, to embroider, and to conduct herself with grace and propriety in social situations. But she was not encouraged to pursue serious intellectual study or to contemplate a role beyond that of helpmeet to a husband and guardian of his household. The education available to girls from prosperous families emphasized refinement over rigor, manners over mathematics, and the development of qualities that would make them pleasing companions rather than independent thinkers. The practice of medicine in the 1820s bore little resemblance to the profession it would become in later decades. Physicians, who tended to come from the ranks of gentlemen and who had received university education, attended to the ailments of the wealthy and the well-connected, prescribing treatments that often relied more on tradition and theory than on empirical observation or scientific understanding. Surgeons, who had trained through apprenticeship, rather than university study, occupied a somewhat lower social position and dealt primarily with injuries, amputations, and other procedures that required manual skill. Below both physicians and surgeons in the medical hierarchy stood the apothecaries, who prepared and dispensed medicines and who often served as the first point of contact for those seeking medical assistance. Nursing, to the extent that it existed as a recognizable occupation, was not regarded as a respectable profession for women of any social standing. The work of tending to the sick in hospitals and charitable institutions was performed largely by women from the poorest classes, many of whom had no formal training and whose reputations were often questionable. Hospitals themselves were places to be avoided if possible, institutions where the indigent and the desperate went when they had no other recourse, and where conditions were frequently squalid and care rudimentary. The concept of trained professional nursing did not exist, and the idea that a woman of education and good family might choose to work in a hospital would have struck most people as not merely unusual, but thoroughly inappropriate and even scandalous. Religious faith permeated Victorian society, providing both a framework for understanding the world and a set of prescriptions for proper conduct. The evangelical movement within the Church of England had gained considerable strength, emphasizing personal piety, moral earnestness, and a sense of duty toward those less fortunate. Charitable work, particularly among the poor and the sick, was encouraged as a manifestation of Christian compassion, though such work was expected to be undertaken in ways that did not compromise social propriety or place young women in situations that might be considered morally hazardous. Religious institutions and charitable societies organized visits to the homes of the poor, distributed food and clothing, and operated schools for children whose families could not afford education, but these efforts were carefully managed to ensure that those who participated, especially young women, remained protected from the harsher realities of poverty and suffering. The political landscape of the early Victorian era was marked by gradual reform rather than revolutionary change. The Reform Act of 1832 would expand the franchise to include more of the middle class, though it would leave the majority of the population, including all women, without the right to vote. Questions of public health, sanitation, and the conditions of the working poor were beginning to attract attention from reformers and legislators, but progress was slow and often met with resistance from those who believed that government intervention in such matters was either unnecessary or an inappropriate infringement on individual liberty. The prevailing attitude among the governing class held that poverty and illness were largely the result of moral failings or natural misfortune, and that while charity might alleviate some suffering, fundamental change to social structures was neither desirable nor practical. Into this world of rigid social hierarchies, limited opportunities for women, primitive medical care, and deeply held beliefs about the proper ordering of society, Florence Nightingale was born on May 12, 1820. The birth took place in the city of Florence, Italy, during an extended tour of the continent undertaken by William Edward Nightingale and his wife, Frances Smith Nightingale. The family had been traveling for more than a year, visiting the capitals and cultural centers of Europe, as was customary for wealthy English families seeking to broaden their experience and provide their children with exposure to art, architecture, and the refinements of continental society. The infant was named after the city of her birth, following a practice the family had already employed with her older sister Parthenope, who had been born in Naples and named after that city's Greek name. William Nightingale had inherited substantial estates in Derbyshire and Hampshire, properties that generated income sufficient to support a life of comfort and leisure. He was a man of liberal political views, interested in questions of social reform, and supportive of efforts to extend education and political participation to broader segments of the population. His education at Cambridge had instilled in him an appreciation for classical learning and rational inquiry, and he took seriously his responsibilities as a landowner and as a member of the class that exercised considerable influence over local affairs. Frances Nightingale, known as Fanny, came from a family of merchants and politicians, and she possessed strong opinions about the proper conduct of social life and the importance of maintaining the family's position within county society. The Nightingale family maintained two principal residences. Lea Hurst in Derbyshire served as their summer home, a substantial house situated in countryside that offered opportunities for walking and riding. Embley Park, in Hampshire, was the larger and more formal establishment where they spent the greater portion of the year, and where they entertained guests and participated in the social activities expected of a family of their standing. Both properties were staffed by servants who managed the daily operations of the household, and the family moved between them according to the season and their social obligations. Florence and her sister received their education at home, as was typical for girls of their class. William Nightingale took personal responsibility for much of their instruction, teaching them Latin, Greek, French, German, Italian, history, and mathematics. This was an unusual curriculum for young women of the period, far more rigorous than the typical education focused on accomplishments and social graces. Florence proved an eager and capable student, demonstrating particular aptitude for languages and for the systematic analysis of historical and political questions. She read widely in her father's library, studying works of philosophy, history, and political economy that were seldom considered appropriate material for young women. The rhythm of life at Embley Park followed the established patterns of the English gentry. The family rose at set times, took meals together, received visitors, attended church services, and participated in the rounds of dinners, balls, and house parties that constituted the social season. Florence was expected to be present for these activities, to dress appropriately, to make conversation with guests, to show interest in the concerns and interests of those around her, and to conduct herself in ways that reflected well upon her family. She learned to play the piano, though she showed no particular passion for music. She sketched and painted in watercolors, activities that provided acceptable pastimes for a young woman, and that could be pursued in the company of other ladies during afternoon visits. As Florence moved through her teenage years, her mother began to direct increasing attention toward the question of her eventual marriage. A girl of her background and fortune could expect to attract suitors from among the sons of landed families or from the professional class, and a successful match would secure her social position and provide her with a household of her own to manage. The expectations were clear. Florence would be presented at court, would participate in the London season, would attend the balls and parties where young women of her class met eligible men, and would in due course accept a proposal from someone deemed suitable by her family. Her life would then follow the path taken by countless other women of her class. A life centered on home, husband, children, and the management of domestic affairs. Yet even during these years of conventional upbringing, Florence experienced moments of profound restlessness and dissatisfaction. She kept journals in which she recorded her thoughts and feelings, and in these private pages she expressed a sense that her life as it was currently constituted lacked purpose and meaning. The endless round of social engagements, the conversations about fashion and gossip, the emphasis on appearance and propriety, all seemed to her hollow and unsatisfying. She felt within herself a desire to accomplish something of substance, to apply her intellectual capacities to work that mattered, to make some contribution that would extend beyond the narrow confines of drawing rooms and dinner parties. In February of 1837, when Florence was 16 years old, she recorded in her diary an experience that she would later describe as a call from God. She was at Embley Park, and she heard what she interpreted as a divine voice speaking to her, though she could not at the time discern what specific service God was calling her to perform. This sense of having been chosen for some particular work would stay with her through the years that followed, creating a tension between her inner conviction that she had a mission to fulfill and the external pressures to conform to the life expected of her. The next several years saw Florence attempting to reconcile these competing demands. She continued to participate in family life, to accompany her mother and sister on visits, and to London for the season, and to fulfill the duties expected of a daughter of the household. At the same time, she pursued her studies with increasing seriousness, reading works on mathematics, statistics, philosophy, and social reform. She became particularly interested in questions related to poverty, public health, and the conditions of hospitals and workhouses. She began to collect reports and documents that addressed these subjects, creating for herself an informal education in matters that were far removed from the typical concerns of a young woman in her position. During a family tour of Europe in 1837 and 1838, Florence had the opportunity to observe different societies and different approaches to social problems. She visited hospitals and charitable institutions in various cities, noting the conditions she found and the methods employed by those who worked there. In some places, she encountered religious communities of women who had dedicated their lives to caring for the sick and the poor, living under vows and following a disciplined routine of prayer and service. These visits made a strong impression on her, suggesting the possibility that women could engage in serious, meaningful work if they organized themselves in ways that commanded respect and provided protection from the suspicions and criticisms that often attended female activity outside the domestic sphere. Upon returning to England, Florence found herself increasingly at odds with her mother over the question of her future. Fanny Nightingale could not understand why. Her daughter, who had every advantage of education, beauty, and fortune, seemed so reluctant to embrace the life that had been prepared for her. Florence received proposals of marriage from respectable men, but she declined them, explaining that she could not commit herself to marriage when she felt called to some other purpose. Her refusals caused distress within the family, as they seemed to threaten Florence's prospects and to reflect poorly on her judgment and her sense of filial duty. The conflict between Florence and her mother intensified through the early 1840s. Florence requested permission to study nursing, but her mother refused, horrified at the idea that her daughter would seek training in an occupation associated with women of dubious character and with work that was considered unsuitable for anyone of refinement. Florence argued that nursing could be reformed, that it could be made into a respectable profession if women of education and good character entered it and established proper standards of training and conduct. Her arguments made no impression on her mother, who saw only the social disgrace that would attend such a decision. During these years of struggle and frustration, Florence maintained her studies and her collection of information about hospitals and health care. She corresponded with people who worked in various charitable and medical institutions, seeking to learn more about their methods and their challenges. She visited hospitals when she could do so without attracting undue attention from her family, observing the conditions and making notes about what she saw. She read reports published by government commissions and by reformers who were advocating for improvements in public health and sanitation. Gradually, she was building for herself a body of knowledge that few people of her time possessed, and certainly few women. In 1844, Florence met Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe and his wife Julia Ward Howe, who were visiting England from America. Dr. Howe directed the Perkins Institution for the Blind in Boston, and Florence found in him someone who understood her desire to engage in serious work of social benefit. He encouraged her to pursue her interests and assured her that it was possible to do meaningful work while maintaining respectability, though he acknowledged that the path would not be easy and that she would face considerable opposition. This conversation, brief though it was, strengthened Florence's resolve to find a way forward despite the obstacles before her. The period between 1845 and 1851 marked a time of gradual progress toward Florence's goals, though that progress was often interrupted by setbacks and by periods of enforced idleness when family obligations or her mother's opposition prevented her from pursuing her interests. She continued to live at Embley Park and Lea Hurst, participating in the social activities expected of her while she searched for opportunities to gain practical experience in nursing and hospital administration. In 1846, Florence received permission from her family to travel to Rome with Charles and Selina Bracebridge, friends of the Nightingales, who shared Florence's interest in social reform. During this extended stay in Rome, Florence met Sidney Herbert, a member of Parliament who would become one of her most important allies in her later work. Herbert and his wife, Elizabeth, were deeply engaged in charitable work and in efforts to improve conditions for the poor. Florence found in them kindred spirits who understood her aspirations and who did not regard her interests as inappropriate or eccentric. This friendship would prove crucial in the years ahead. While in Rome, Florence also had the opportunity to visit hospitals and religious institutions, observing the work of Catholic sisters who cared for the sick. She was particularly impressed by the discipline and organization of these communities, the way they combined religious devotion with practical service, and the respect they commanded despite engaging in work that would be considered degrading for women in Protestant countries. She began to consider whether similar institutions might be established in England, where Protestant women could receive training and could work under conditions that would protect them from the criticisms and dangers that attended nursing as it currently existed. Upon returning to England in 1847, Florence resumed her life in the family homes, but she had become more determined than ever to find a way to pursue nursing. She requested permission to spend 3 months at Salisbury Infirmary to study hospital organization and nursing practices. Her mother and sister objected strenuously, and the request was denied. The refusal led to a period of deep depression for Florence, during which she felt trapped between her sense of divine calling and the impossibility of acting on it. She described this period in her journals as one of darkness and despair, feeling that her life was being wasted in trivial pursuits, while the work she believed she was meant to do remained beyond her reach. In 1849, Florence traveled to Egypt and Greece with the Bracebridges, a journey that provided both relief from the tensions at home and opportunities for further observation of hospitals and charitable institutions. During her time in Egypt, she visited hospitals in Alexandria and Cairo, and she spent time at the institution of Protestant deaconesses in Kaiserswerth, Germany, on the return journey. Kaiserswerth was a pioneering institution where Protestant women received training in nursing and where they lived in a community that combined religious commitment with practical service. The institution had been founded by Pastor Theodor Fleidner and his wife, and it provided a model for how nursing could be practiced in a way that was both effective and respectable. Florence was deeply moved by what she saw at Kaiserswerth. The deaconesses received systematic training in the care of the sick. They worked under supervision and according to established procedures, and they lived in a community that provided support and protection. The institution combined a hospital, a school for training nurses, an infant school, and a home for female prisoners who were being rehabilitated. Florence spent only 2 weeks at Kaiserswerth during this first visit, but she came away convinced that this model, or something like it, could be adapted for use in England. In 1851, Florence returned to Kaiserswerth for a 3-month stay, during which she underwent training in nursing. She rose early each morning to attend religious services with the deaconesses, then spent her days working in the hospital wards, learning how to dress wounds, how to administer medications, how to maintain cleanliness, how to keep records, and how to provide comfort to patients who were suffering or dying. The work was physically demanding, and the conditions were far from luxurious, but Florence thrived in this environment. She finally had the opportunity to engage in the work she had long desired to do, and she discovered that she possessed both the stamina and the aptitude for it. The daily routine at Kaiserswerth began at 5 in the morning with prayers, followed by breakfast and then assignments to various departments of the institution. Florence worked alongside the deaconesses, learning by doing and by observing those who had more experience. She cleaned floors, changed bandages, sat with dying patients, prepared bodies for burial, and performed all the tasks that constituted the daily work of nursing. She kept detailed notes about what she observed, recording procedures, methods of organization, and ideas for how similar institutions might be established elsewhere. The training emphasized not only the technical skills of nursing, but also the importance of character, discipline, and commitment to service. The deaconesses understood. Their work as a religious vocation something undertaken not for personal gain or recognition, but as an expression of Christian love and obedience to God's call. This framework appealed to Florence, who had long understood her own desire to nurse as a response to divine calling. The Kaiserswerth model showed that it was possible to create institutions where women could pursue this calling in ways that were both effective and protected from the criticisms that often attended female work outside the home. After completing her training at Kaiserswerth, Florence returned to England with a certificate of completion and with a much clearer sense of how she might proceed. She had gained practical experience, she had seen a functioning model of professional nursing, and she had proved to herself that she possessed the capacity to do this work. However, she still faced the opposition of her mother and sister, who were horrified by her decision to train at Kaiserswerth and who feared that her association with nursing would damage both her own reputation and that of the family. The conflict within the family reached a crisis point in 1852 and 1853. Florence was now in her early 30s, an age at which unmarried women of her class were increasingly seen as settled in spinsterhood. She had repeatedly refused marriage proposals, she had pursued training that her family considered inappropriate, and she showed no inclination to settle into the quiet life of charitable works and family visits that might have been acceptable for an unmarried woman of her position. Her mother and sister regarded her behavior as selfish and incomprehensible, a rejection of family duty and social responsibility. Florence, for her part, felt suffocated by the constraints placed upon her. She wrote in her journals about the crushing weight of family expectations, the endless hours spent in pursuits that seemed to her meaningless, and her anguish at being prevented from using her abilities in ways that could make a real difference in the world. She experienced periods of severe depression and physical illness, symptoms that modern observers might recognize as manifestations of the psychological strain she was under, but which were interpreted at the time as evidence of fragility or nervous disorder. In 1853, a compromise of sorts was reached. Florence was offered the position of superintendent of the Institution for the Care of Sick Gentlewomen in Distressed Circumstances, a small charitable hospital in London that provided care for governesses and other women of the middle class who had fallen on hard times. The position was unpaid, which made it somewhat more acceptable to her family, and the institution served a population that was considered respectable, which reduced the social stigma associated with hospital work. Florence accepted the position, understanding that it would give her practical experience in hospital administration and would allow her to begin implementing the reforms she had been contemplating. The work of reorganizing the Institution for Sick Gentlewomen occupied Florence through the latter part of 1853 and into 1854. She examined every aspect of the hospital's operations, from the admission procedures to the arrangement of the wards to the systems for purchasing supplies. She introduced changes designed to improve efficiency and to ensure that patients received better care. She insisted on cleanliness, proper ventilation, and adequate nutrition. She worked to establish clear lines of authority and responsibility among the staff. She kept detailed records of admissions, treatments, and outcomes, believing that systematic data collection was essential for evaluating and improving medical care. Her approach to this work demonstrated characteristics that would mark all her later efforts: attention to detail, reliance on systematic observation and data, willingness to challenge established practices, and determination to implement changes despite resistance. She worked long hours, often staying at the hospital late into the evening and returning early in the morning. She corresponded extensively with suppliers, with members of the hospital's governing committee, and with others who could provide expertise or support. She visited other hospitals to observe their methods and to gather ideas that might be adapted for use at the institution. The daily routine during this period established patterns that Florence would maintain throughout much of her working life. She rose early, often before dawn, and devoted the early morning hours to correspondence and to planning the day's activities. She spent much of the day at the hospital, moving through the wards, conferring with nurses and physicians, checking on supplies and equipment, and addressing problems as they arose. She took her meals quickly and often irregularly, viewing them more as necessary fuel than as occasions for leisure or socializing. In the evenings, she returned to her lodgings to work on reports, to analyze data, to write letters, and to read professional literature that might inform her work. This period of work at the Institution for Sick Gentlewomen provided Florence with valuable experience and with evidence that she could successfully manage a medical institution. It also brought her to the attention of people who were in positions to offer her larger opportunities. Among these was Sidney Herbert, her friend from Rome, who had become Secretary at War in the British government and who would soon face a crisis that would require exactly the kind of expertise that Florence had been developing. In March of 1854, Britain entered into war with Russia over questions related to the declining Ottoman Empire and to the balance of power in Europe. The conflict, which would become known as the Crimean War, pitted Britain and France in alliance with the Ottoman Empire against Russia. British forces were sent to the Crimean Peninsula, where they would lay siege to the Russian naval base at Sevastopol. The war was expected to be relatively brief and contained, a matter of demonstrating British resolve and protecting strategic interests. By autumn of 1854, however, reports reaching London indicated that the British military expedition was suffering from serious problems in organization and supply. Soldiers were falling ill with cholera, dysentery, and other diseases at alarming rates. Those who were wounded in battle often died not from their injuries themselves, but from the infections and fevers that followed. The military hospitals established to treat the sick and wounded were overwhelmed and poorly equipped. Accounts published in newspapers, particularly those filed by William Howard Russell, the correspondent for The Times, described conditions of shocking inadequacy and suffering. The reports caused public outrage in Britain. The nation had sent its soldiers to fight for British interests, and it appeared that those soldiers were being left to die from preventable causes due to administrative incompetence and lack of proper medical facilities. Comparisons were drawn with the French military medical services, which seemed to be better organized and which benefited from the assistance of the Sisters of Charity, Catholic nuns who provided nursing care. The British public demanded that something be done to address the crisis. Sidney Herbert, in his capacity as Secretary at War, was responsible for addressing the situation. He knew that Florence Nightingale had been advocating for reforms in nursing and hospital administration, and he knew of her training and experience. On October 15, 1854, he wrote to Florence asking her to lead a mission of nurses to the military hospitals in the East. His letter and Florence's acceptance of the mission crossed in the mail. She had already written to him offering her services. The decision to send Florence to the Crimea represented a significant departure from established practice. The British military had never before employed female nurses in military hospitals, and there was considerable skepticism about whether women could manage the conditions they would encounter or whether their presence would create more problems than it solved. Herbert's decision to appoint Florence reflected both his confidence in her abilities and the political necessity of being seen to take action in response to public pressure. Florence spent the next several weeks recruiting nurses, organizing supplies, and making arrangements for the journey. She selected 38 women to accompany her, including Anglican sisters, Catholic sisters, and lay nurses. The selection process was careful. Florence understood that the success of the mission would depend not only on the nurses' skills, but also on their ability to work together despite differences in religious background and to maintain discipline and propriety under difficult circumstances. She also understood that any scandal or evidence of impropriety would be seized upon by critics as proof that women should not be involved in military nursing. The party sailed from London on October 21st, 1854, and arrived at Scutari, across the Bosporus from Constantinople, on November 4th. The hospital at Scutari was housed in a former Turkish barracks, a massive building that had been hastily converted to medical use. When Florence and her nurses arrived, they found conditions far worse than they had anticipated. The building was filthy, with sewage backing up into the corridors and rats scurrying through the wards. Supplies were inadequate, with shortages of basic necessities such as bandages, beds, and clean linens. The wounded and sick lay on the floor, often in their own excrement, with little in the way of comfort or care. The death rate was horrific, with hundreds dying each week from infections and diseases. Florence immediately set about organizing the work of her nurses and addressing the most urgent problems. She established a routine for the nurses, assigning them to specific wards and shifts, and ensuring that they maintained discipline and proper conduct. She requisitioned supplies, often purchasing them with her own funds when official channels proved too slow. She organized the cleaning of the wards, the washing of linens, and the preparation of nutritious food for patients. She worked to establish a kitchen that could produce soups and other foods suitable for sick men, supplementing the inadequate rations provided by the military commissariat. The daily routine at Scutari during the months following Florence's arrival was one of unrelenting labor. She rose early each morning and spent hours moving through the wards, checking on patients, conferring with medical officers, addressing problems with supplies or staffing, and ensuring that the nurses were fulfilling their duties. She kept detailed records of admissions, deaths, and the consumption of supplies. She wrote long reports to Sidney Herbert and to others in London, documenting the conditions and requesting additional resources. She worked late into the night, often not retiring until 2 or 3 in the morning, and even then she might be called to attend to emergencies. The nurses under Florence's supervision worked according to strict rules. They were to maintain professional conduct at all times to avoid any behavior that might be construed as improper or that might invite criticism. They were not to work in the wards without the permission of the medical officers, a rule that sometimes frustrated them, but that was necessary to maintain good relations with the physicians and to avoid territorial disputes. They were to keep themselves clean and properly dressed, to follow Florence's instructions, and to report any problems or concerns to her directly. Florence herself became a constant presence in the hospital. She moved through the wards at all hours, carrying a lamp to light. Her way during her nighttime rounds, a detail that would later become central to her public image and to the mythology that grew up around her. Soldiers came to know her as someone who cared about their welfare, who would listen to their concerns, who could write letters home for those too ill to write, and who could arrange for small comforts that made their suffering more bearable. She represented order, cleanliness, and compassion in a place where chaos and death had seemed to prevail. The winter of 1854 to 1855 was a period of crisis. Casualties from the siege of Sevastopol continued to arrive, many of them suffering from frostbite and exposure as well as from wounds. Disease continued to ravage the army, with cholera, typhus, and dysentery spreading through the crowded barracks and trenches. The hospital at Scutari received thousands of patients, far more than it was equipped to handle. Despite the improvements Florence had made, the death rate remained extremely high, and she struggled to understand why her efforts seemed to be having limited effect. The problem, though Florence did not fully understand it at the time, lay in the fundamental sanitary conditions of the building. The hospital was built over a defective sewer system that was leaching contamination into the water supply and creating a miasma of foul air that hung over the wards. No amount of cleaning or organization could overcome these underlying structural problems, and it would take months before the issue was identified and addressed through major engineering work. In the meantime, Florence continued to work with the tools and knowledge available to her, making incremental improvements and providing what comfort she could. By spring of 1855, Florence's reputation had spread throughout the British Army and had reached the public at home. Soldiers' letters mentioned the lady with the lamp who cared for the sick. Newspaper reports described her work in terms that were often exaggerated and romanticized, but that served to establish her as a symbol of compassionate care and effective action. The government recognized her contributions and granted her increased authority over nursing services in the military hospitals. She became, in effect, the superintendent of all female nursing in the British military medical services in the East. With this expanded authority came increased responsibilities and increased opposition. Some medical officers resented her influence and her criticisms of their work. Some officials in the military administration regarded her as an interference in matters beyond her proper sphere. Some nurses chafed under her strict discipline and her demanding standards. Florence responded to these challenges by maintaining meticulous records, by ensuring that she had official authorization for her actions, and by building alliances with those in positions of power who supported her work. In May of 1855, Florence traveled to the Crimean Peninsula itself to inspect the hospitals there and to extend her reforms to those facilities. She visited hospitals at Balaclava and elsewhere, observing conditions and implementing changes. The journey was physically taxing, and she fell ill with what was diagnosed as Crimean fever, probably a form of typhus or brucellosis. She nearly died, and her recovery was slow and incomplete. The illness left her with chronic health problems that would affect her for the rest of her life, but she returned to her work as soon as she was able, determined to continue the mission she had undertaken. The period from mid-1855 through the end of the war in early 1856 saw Florence continuing to work to improve conditions in the military hospitals, to train and supervise nurses, and to gather data about the causes of mortality among British soldiers. She had come to understand that most deaths were not from battle wounds, but from disease, and that these deaths were preventable with proper sanitation, nutrition, and medical care. She began to envision a larger mission, not just to improve conditions during this particular war, but to reform the entire system of military medical care and to establish nursing as a professional discipline. When the war ended in March of 1856, Florence returned to England in July, deliberately avoiding public ceremonies and acclaim. She traveled under an assumed name and went directly to a family property rather than to London, seeking to avoid the attention that she knew awaited her. She was now famous, celebrated as the heroine of the Crimean War, the lady with the lamp who had saved countless lives through her dedication and compassion. The reality, as she knew, was more complicated. Many men had died despite her efforts, and she believed that with better organization and better understanding of sanitation and disease, many more could have been saved. Florence Nightingale returned to England in the summer of 1856 as a celebrated national figure, but she viewed her fame as a burden rather than as an achievement to be enjoyed. She had no interest in public appearances or in the social recognition that others sought. Instead, she immediately directed her attention to the work she considered essential, using her experience and the data she had gathered to reform the military medical system and to prevent the catastrophic loss of life she had witnessed. Within weeks of her return, Florence began meeting with officials from the War Office and with members of Parliament who had influence over military affairs. She brought with her extensive documentation of the conditions she had observed and detailed statistics about mortality rates in the military hospitals. She argued that the high death rates were not inevitable consequences of warfare, but were the result of preventable failures in sanitation, organization, and medical care. She proposed the establishment of a royal commission to investigate the health of the army and to make recommendations for reform. The proposal for a royal commission met with resistance from multiple quarters. Some military officials regarded any investigation as an implicit criticism of their performance and as an unwarranted intrusion into military affairs by civilians. Some physicians disputed Florence's emphasis on sanitation and environmental factors, preferring to attribute disease to miasma, moral deficiency, or other causes beyond administrative control. Some government officials worried about the cost of implementing reforms and about the political complications that might arise from publicly examining the failures of the military medical system. Florence persisted in her advocacy, working through her contacts and allies to build support for the commission. Sidney Herbert agreed to use his influence, and other sympathetic members of Parliament joined the effort. Queen Victoria, who had followed reports of Florence's work in the Crimea and who had expressed admiration for her service, also supported the idea. In May of 1857, the Royal Commission on the Health of the Army was formally established, with Sidney Herbert serving as chairman. The work of preparing for and supporting the Commission's investigation occupied much of Florence's time and energy during 1857 and 1858. She could not serve as an official member of the Commission, as women were not permitted to hold such positions, but she worked behind the scenes, gathering evidence, preparing statistical analyses, drafting questions for witnesses, and writing reports that would inform the Commission's deliberations. She corresponded with experts in sanitation, statistics, and public health, seeking their input and their support for the reforms she was proposing. The daily routine during this period involved long hours of work in her rooms in London. Florence would rise early and spend the morning hours writing, often producing thousands of words, analyzing data, drafting proposals, or corresponding with officials. She would receive visitors in the afternoon, though she carefully controlled who was admitted, preferring to spend her time with those who could advance her work rather than with those who simply wished to meet the famous lady with the lamp. In the evenings, she continued writing, often working until late at night or even until dawn. The chronic illness Florence had contracted in the Crimea continued to affect her health, manifesting in fatigue, digestive problems, and episodes of severe pain and weakness. She often worked from her bed or from a couch, receiving visitors in her bedroom when she was too ill to sit up for extended periods. Medical professionals of the time could not identify the specific cause of her symptoms, and some suggested that her illness was largely nervous or psychological in nature. Florence herself believed that she did not have long to live, and this belief drove her to work with even greater intensity, determined to accomplish as much as possible in whatever time remained to her. The Royal Commission heard testimony from numerous witnesses throughout 1857, including military officers, medical personnel, sanitary experts, and others with knowledge of conditions in military hospitals and barracks. The evidence confirmed what Florence had been arguing, that the majority of deaths during the Crimean War had resulted from diseases that were spread through poor sanitation, inadequate ventilation, contaminated water, and overcrowding. The Commission's report, published in 1858, included detailed recommendations for reforming Army medical services, improving barracks and hospital facilities, establishing better systems for collecting and analyzing health data, and creating a training program for military medical officers. Florence had drafted much of the report herself, though her name did not appear on it. She had prepared statistical tables and charts, including innovative visual representations of data that made the evidence more accessible and compelling. She had written sections of the text, incorporating the principles she had learned from her study of statistics and from her observations in the Crimea. The report represented a major achievement in the application of systematic data analysis to questions of public health and military organization. The publication of the Commission's report did not, however, lead immediately to the implementation of its recommendations. Government bureaucracies moved slowly, and there was resistance from officials who disputed the report's findings or who were reluctant to authorize the expenditures required for the proposed reforms. Florence found herself engaged in a prolonged campaign to ensure that the Commission's work would actually produce changes rather than simply being filed away and forgotten. She wrote letters to officials at all levels of government, from clerks to cabinet ministers. She met with members of Parliament, explaining the importance of the proposed reforms and urging them to support necessary legislation and appropriations. She prepared simplified versions of the Commission's findings for publication in newspapers and magazines, seeking to build public support for reform. She cultivated relationships with influential figures who could advance her cause, while maintaining her preference for working behind the scenes rather than seeking public recognition. During this same period, Florence also turned her attention to broader questions of hospital design and nursing reform. She had been asked to advise on the construction of new hospitals in Britain and in British colonies, and she developed detailed specifications for how hospitals should be built to maximize ventilation, light, and cleanliness while minimizing the spread of disease. Her recommendations emphasized the importance of the pavilion plan, in which hospital wards were arranged in separate buildings or wings to allow for cross-ventilation and to prevent the concentration of contaminated air. The work of establishing nursing as a professional discipline required addressing several interconnected challenges. Nursing, as it existed in most British hospitals, was still performed largely by untrained women of poor character, and the occupation had a terrible reputation. Hospitals were reluctant to change their practices. Physicians often viewed nurses as merely servants who should follow orders without question, and there was no established system for training or credentialing nurses. Florence understood that real reform would require creating institutions that could train nurses properly, establishing standards for the profession, and demonstrating that well-trained nurses could improve patient outcomes. In 1859, Florence published Notes on Nursing, What It Is and What It Is Not, a book intended both for professional nurses and for women who cared for family members at home. The book emphasized fundamental principles of sanitation, ventilation, cleanliness, nutrition, and observation. It became widely read and was translated into several languages, establishing Florence as an authority on nursing practice and on the care of the sick. The book's success helped to elevate the status of nursing and to establish it as a field that required knowledge and skill rather than merely kindness or obedience. The question of how to establish a proper training program for nurses had been under discussion since Florence's return from the Crimea. Various proposals had been considered, and funds had been raised through a public subscription that acknowledged Florence's service during the war. In 1860, the Nightingale Training School for Nurses was established at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, with Florence having significant influence over its organization and curriculum. The school accepted young women of good character and provided them with a year of training under the supervision of experienced nurses. The students lived in a home attached to the hospital, following rules designed to protect their reputation and to ensure proper conduct. Florence did not serve as the school's director or as an instructor, as her health prevented her from taking on such direct responsibilities. Instead, she worked through correspondence and through carefully chosen intermediaries, advising on policies, reviewing reports on students' progress, and ensuring that the school maintained the standards she had established. She insisted that the school should produce nurses who combined technical competence with strong moral character, who understood the principles underlying their practice, and who could serve as models for others seeking to enter the profession. The establishment of the training school represented a significant achievement, but it also created new pressures and conflicts. The school's matron and the medical staff at St. Thomas's Hospital did not always agree with Florence's directives, and there were disputes about curriculum, discipline, and the relationship between the school and the hospital. Florence found herself managing these conflicts from a distance, relying on letters and on occasional meetings with key individuals to maintain her influence over the school's operations. Throughout the late 1850s and early 1860s, Florence's health continued to deteriorate. She experienced episodes of severe illness that confined her to bed for weeks or months at a time. She saw few visitors beyond those whose presence was necessary for her work. She lived primarily in her rooms in London, maintaining a routine of work that was interrupted only by her illnesses. Her family worried about her, and her sister and mother visited when permitted, but Florence maintained firm control over her time and her activities, refusing to be drawn back into the social obligations and family concerns that she had rejected years earlier. The chronic nature of her illness and her isolation from normal social intercourse led to tensions with her family. Her mother and sister could not understand why Florence refused invitations, avoided social gatherings, and seemed to care only about her work. They interpreted her behavior as stubbornness or as evidence of continued illness, and they urged her to rest more and to work less. Florence, however, believed that her work was essential and that rest would be a dereliction of her duty. She continued to produce reports, letters, and memoranda at a pace that would have been remarkable even for someone in perfect health. The reforming work extended beyond nursing and military medicine to encompass broader questions of public health, sanitation, and hospital administration. Florence was consulted on the design of hospitals in Britain, India, Australia, and elsewhere. She advised on sanitation systems for cities and for military installations. She prepared reports on the health conditions of various populations, including soldiers in India and the working poor in British cities. Her work was characterized by careful attention to statistical evidence, by systematic analysis of causes and effects, and by practical recommendations grounded in empirical observation. The pressure of this sustained work took its toll. Florence's productivity was extraordinary, but it came at the cost of her physical health and of her relationships with others. She drove herself relentlessly, believing that she was in a race against time and that she must accomplish as much as possible before her health failed completely. She held those who worked with her to similarly demanding standards, sometimes alienating colleagues and assistants who could not or would not maintain her pace. Her correspondence from this period often included complaints about the incompetence or laziness of others, reflecting her frustration with what she perceived as their failure to understand the urgency of the work. By the middle of the 1860s, Florence Nightingale had established herself as Britain's foremost authority on hospital design, nursing reform, and military medical organization. Governments, both British and foreign, sought her advice on matters ranging from the construction of new hospitals to the organization of medical services during wartime. She continued to work from her rooms in London, receiving reports and correspondence, writing memoranda and letters of advice, and maintaining relationships with officials who could implement the reforms she advocated. The daily routine of these years followed patterns that had become firmly established. Florence rose at a regular hour, took a simple breakfast, and then settled into the work of reading reports, analyzing data, and preparing responses to the questions that had been submitted to her. She maintained an extensive correspondence, writing dozens of letters each week to officials in government, to physicians and hospital administrators, to former students of the Nightingale Training School, and to others who sought her guidance or who could assist in advancing her various projects. Her health remained poor and unpredictable. There were periods when she felt relatively well and could work for many hours without interruption. There were other periods when she was confined to bed, suffering from pain, exhaustion, and other symptoms that prevented sustained mental or physical effort. She adapted her work to these fluctuations, pushing herself during good periods and accepting with frustration the forced rest that came during times of illness. The work on Indian sanitary reform occupied much of Florence's attention during the 1860s and 1870s. Sidney Herbert had involved her in questions related to the health of British soldiers stationed in India, and this work had expanded to encompass broader concerns about public health and sanitation throughout the Indian subcontinent. Florence studied reports on mortality rates among soldiers and among the civilian population. She corresponded with officials in India seeking detailed information about housing conditions, water supply systems, sewage disposal, and other factors that affected health. She prepared proposals for sanitary reforms and advocated for their implementation. The challenge of effecting change in India was complicated by distance, by the complexity of colonial administration, and by resistance from officials who did not share Florence's sense of urgency or who had other priorities. She worked through official channels when possible, but she also cultivated informal networks of supporters who could advance her agenda. She wrote papers on topics such as village sanitation, the health of the native population, and the organization of medical services, distributing these papers to officials and to others who might be influenced by them. During the 1870s, Florence's public profile diminished somewhat as she focused on specific technical projects rather than on broad campaigns that attracted public attention. She continued to be consulted on hospital design, advising on projects in Britain and in other countries. She remained involved with the Nightingale Training School, reviewing reports on students and offering guidance on curriculum and standards. She corresponded with nurses who had trained at the school and who had gone on to positions in hospitals throughout Britain and in British colonies, offering advice and encouragement. The question of her legacy and of how to ensure that her work would continue after her death began to occupy some of Florence's thoughts during this period. She had accumulated a vast archive of reports, correspondence, statistical tables, and other documents related to her various projects. She had developed expertise in areas ranging from hospital ventilation systems to the statistical analysis of disease patterns. She had established the Nightingale Training School and had influenced the development of nursing as a profession. The question was how to preserve and extend this work in ways that would outlive her. Florence's relationship with her family remained complicated. Her father had died in 1874, and this loss affected her deeply, despite the tensions that had existed between them over the years. Her mother lived until 1880, and during her final years Florence visited her occasionally, though the relationship remained strained. Her sister Parthenope, who had married Sir Harry Verney, maintained contact with Florence and occasionally served as an intermediary in family matters, but the two sisters never fully reconciled their different understandings of duty and purpose. The work of the later 1870s and 1880s was less dramatic than the campaigns of earlier decades, but it remained substantial. Florence continued to prepare reports on specific questions related to public health and hospital administration. She advised on the organization of nursing services in various hospitals and in the military. She maintained her interest in statistical methods and in the use of data to inform policy decisions. She wrote on topics such as the training of midwives, the organization of workhouse infirmaries, and the management of patient records. Her daily routine became more restricted as she aged. She spent most of her time in her rooms, seeing few visitors and maintaining contact with the outside world primarily through correspondence. She employed secretaries who assisted with the volume of letters and reports that she produced, but she maintained personal control over the content and direction of her work. She read widely, staying informed about developments in medicine, public health, and sanitation, and she incorporated new knowledge into her recommendations and advice. The chronic health problems that had affected Florence since the Crimean War continued through her later years, but she adapted to them and maintained her work despite physical limitations. She could no longer move about freely, and she tired more easily than in earlier years, but her mental faculties remained sharp, and her commitment to her work remained undiminished. She continued to believe that systematic observation, careful analysis, and determined advocacy could produce improvements in the care of the sick and in the health of populations. In 1883, Queen Victoria awarded Florence the Royal Red Cross for her contributions to nursing and to the care of the sick. The recognition pleased her, though she maintained her preference for working behind the scenes rather than seeking public acclaim. She continued to decline most invitations to public events and to interviews with journalists, preferring to let her work speak for itself and to avoid the sort of personal publicity that she had always found distasteful. During the 1890s, Florence's activity level declined further. She still maintained correspondence and offered advice when consulted, but she no longer undertook major new projects or campaigns. The world of medicine and public health had changed considerably since her early work, with new discoveries about the causes of disease, new treatments, and new approaches to hospital organization. Some of Florence's specific recommendations had been superseded by these developments, but her fundamental principles regarding the importance of cleanliness, proper ventilation, good nutrition, and systematic observation remained relevant. The Nightingale Training School continued to operate, producing nurses who carried Florence's vision of professional nursing to hospitals throughout Britain and to other countries. Some of these nurses corresponded with Florence, seeking her advice or reporting on their work, and she maintained her interest in the school's operations even as her direct involvement diminished. The school represented one of her most enduring legacies, a concrete institution that would continue to shape nursing education long after her death. Florence spent her final years living quietly in a house in South Street, Mayfair, cared for by nurses and companions. She had occasional visitors, including members of her family and a few old colleagues, but her life was largely one of quiet retirement. She could no longer read extensively or write at length, and much of her time was spent resting or engaged in simple activities. Her mind remained clear, and she retained memories of her long career and of the work she had done. But the energy and determination that had driven her for so many years had finally been exhausted by age and illness. In 1907, Florence became the first woman to be awarded the Order of Merit, a high honor that recognized her lifetime of service and achievement. The award came late in her life, and she was too frail to participate in any public ceremony, but the recognition represented an acknowledgment of the significance of her contributions to nursing, public health, and hospital reform. She had lived to see many of the changes she had advocated become established practice, and she had witnessed the emergence of nursing as a respected profession. Florence Nightingale died on August 13, 1910, at the age of 90, in her home in South Street, Mayfair. The cause of death was recorded as old age. She had lived through the entire Victorian era and into the Edwardian period, witnessing vast changes in British society, in medical science, and in the status of women. Her death was noted in newspapers throughout Britain and in other countries, with articles recounting her service during the Crimean War and her subsequent work in hospital and nursing reform. The question of her funeral and burial had been discussed before her death. Florence had expressed a preference for a simple private funeral and had rejected the idea of burial in Westminster Abbey, an honor that the government had offered. Her wishes were respected, and the funeral was a quiet affair attended by family members and a few close associates. She was buried in the churchyard of St. Margaret's Church, in East Wellow, Hampshire, near the family estate at Embley Park. The grave was marked with a simple stone bearing her initials and the dates of her birth and death. The obituaries and memorial articles that appeared in the days and weeks following her death presented a particular image of Florence Nightingale. Many emphasized her work during the Crimean War, describing her as the lady with the lamp who had brought comfort and care to wounded soldiers. Some mentioned her later work on hospital reform and nursing education, though this was often treated as secondary to her wartime service. The accounts tended to portray her as a figure of compassion and self-sacrifice, emphasizing her dedication to the sick and her willingness to work under difficult conditions. This popular image, while not entirely inaccurate, simplified and sentimentalized a more complex reality. Florence had indeed provided care to soldiers and had worked to improve conditions in military hospitals, but her most significant contributions lay in her systematic analysis of the causes of preventable death, her advocacy for sanitary reform, her development of new methods for collecting and presenting statistical data, and her work to establish nursing as a profession based on training and standards rather than on personal charity. The emotional and dramatic elements of her service in the Crimea had made her famous, but the technical and administrative work of her later years had produced more lasting changes. In the years immediately following her death, the Nightingale Training School continued to operate, training nurses who carried forward the principles Florence had established. The school became a model for other nursing education programs in Britain and abroad, influencing the development of nursing education in ways that extended far beyond the specific institution she had founded. The idea that nursing required systematic training, that nurses should understand the principles underlying their practice, and that nursing could be a respectable profession for educated women became increasingly accepted. The reforms in military medical services that Florence had advocated during and after the Crimean War had been implemented to varying degrees. The British Army had established better systems for sanitation in barracks and hospitals, had improved its procedures for collecting health data, and had created training programs for medical officers. These changes contributed to reduced mortality rates from disease during subsequent military conflicts, though the full implementation of sanitary reforms was a gradual process that extended over several decades. The broader influence of Florence's work on hospital design and public health was evident in the construction of new hospitals according to the pavilion plan she had advocated, in the adoption of improved ventilation and sanitation systems, and in the growing recognition that systematic data collection and analysis could inform public health policy. Her use of statistical methods and visual representations of data influenced the development of public health as a field, demonstrating that empirical observation and quantitative analysis could identify patterns and guide interventions. The status of women in British society had changed considerably during Florence's lifetime, though not as rapidly or as completely as some reformers had hoped. Women had gained access to higher education, had entered various professions, including medicine, and had begun to participate in public life in ways that would have been considered impossible in the early Victorian period. Florence's own career had demonstrated that a woman could exercise significant influence over public policy and could make important contributions to fields such as hospital administration and public health, even without holding formal positions of authority. The mythology that grew up around Florence Nightingale in the decades following her death emphasized certain aspects of her life and work while obscuring others. The image of the lady with the lamp, the gentle nurse caring for wounded soldiers, became iconic, representing an idealized vision of feminine compassion and self-sacrifice. This image served various purposes, including inspiring young women to enter nursing and providing a model of respectable female service. It did not, however, fully capture the harder edges of Florence's personality. Her determination to challenge existing systems, her skill at bureaucratic maneuvering, her sometimes difficult relationships with colleagues, or the intellectual rigor that characterized her approach to reform. Historians examining Florence's life and work in later years would have access to her extensive papers, including her letters, reports, statistical analyses, and private journals. These documents revealed a more complete and more complicated figure than the sentimental image suggested. They showed a woman of extraordinary ability and determination, capable of sustained analytical work and of managing complex campaigns for reform. They also showed someone who was demanding of herself and of others, who could be sharp in her judgments, who experienced periods of despair and frustration, and who struggled with the constraints that society placed on women's activity, even as she worked to expand the boundaries of what was possible. The question of how to assess Florence Nightingale's overall contribution and legacy remained complex. Her most visible achievement, the reform of nursing, had lasting effects, establishing nursing as a profession and creating institutions and standards that would influence medical care for generations. Her work on hospital design and sanitation contributed to improvements in public health and to reductions in preventable deaths from hospital-acquired infections. Her advocacy for the use of statistical methods in analyzing health data helped to establish the field of public health statistics and demonstrated the value of empirical analysis in guiding policy. At the same time, some of her specific ideas about the causes of disease were based on theories, particularly miasma theory, that were later shown to be incorrect or incomplete. Her emphasis on ventilation and environmental factors, while beneficial in many ways, preceded the full understanding of germ theory and the role of microorganisms in causing infection. Later developments in medical science would build on and in some cases supersede the approaches she had advocated. This was not a failure on her part, but rather a reflection of the state of knowledge in her time and of the normal process by which scientific understanding evolves. The institutions she had influenced, particularly the Nightingale Training School and the hospitals built according to her specifications, continued to operate and to adapt to new knowledge and new circumstances. The principles she had established regarding the importance of cleanliness, proper organization, systematic observation, and the professional training of nurses remained relevant even as specific practices and techniques changed. The school produced nurses who became leaders in their field, who established their own training programs, and who carried forward the vision of nursing as a skilled profession grounded in both practical experience and theoretical understanding. The broader social changes that occurred during and after Florence's lifetime created opportunities for women that had not existed earlier. The expansion of education, the opening of professions to women, the gradual extension of political rights, all represented progress toward greater equality and opportunity. Florence's own career both benefited from and contributed to these changes. She had demonstrated that a woman could exercise authority, could influence policy, could contribute to knowledge, and could achieve recognition for her work, even within the constraints of Victorian society. Her example inspired other women to seek roles beyond the domestic sphere and to challenge the limitations placed on female activity. The memory of Florence Nightingale would be preserved through various means in the decades and centuries following her death. Statues and memorials were erected in her honor, hospitals and nursing schools were named after her, books and articles continued to be written about her life and work, and her image appeared on coins and stamps. The Nightingale Pledge, a modified version of the Hippocratic Oath adapted for nurses, was recited by graduating nurses in many countries, linking new generations of nurses to her legacy. International Nurses' Day was established on her birthday, May 12th, as a way of honoring her contributions and celebrating the nursing profession. The evaluation of historical figures changes over time as new perspectives emerge and as different aspects of their lives and work attract attention. Later, scholars examining Florence's career would note not only her achievements, but also the ways in which she had worked within and been constrained by the social and political structures of her time. They would observe that while she had challenged certain limitations on women's activity, she had also accepted others, and that her work had been made possible partly by her social position and by the resources and connections available to someone of her class. They would recognize that her relationships with colleagues, particularly with women who worked under her direction, were sometimes troubled, and that her demanding standards and her tendency to work through indirect influence rather than direct authority created tensions. These more nuanced assessments did not diminish the significance of what Florence had accomplished, but rather placed her achievements in context, recognizing both the remarkable nature of her work and the specific historical circumstances in which it occurred. She had lived during a period of significant social change, had responded to opportunities created by crisis and by evolving attitudes, and had used her abilities and resources to effect improvements in medical care, in nursing education, and in public health. The specific forms that her work took were shaped by the knowledge, institutions, and social structures of Victorian Britain, but the underlying commitment to systematic observation, to the reduction of preventable suffering, and to the improvement of care for the sick transcended that particular time and place. The story of Florence Nightingale's life, from her birth during her family's continental tour, through her struggles to find meaningful work, from her service in the Crimean War, through her decades of reforming labor, and from her eventual recognition and honors, through her quiet final years and death, represented one individual's response to the challenges and opportunities of her age. The path she followed was shaped by personal conviction, by social circumstances, by chance opportunities, and by the resistance and support of others. The legacy she left consisted not only of specific institutions and reforms, but also of an example of how determination, systematic analysis, and sustained effort could produce significant change even in the face of considerable obstacles.